It was a week before Halloween, and Emily was determined to have the scariest costume at the school's Halloween party. She had been to every store in town, but nothing seemed terrifying enough, just the usual cheap masks and plastic props. Disappointed, she wandered through a part of town she rarely visited when she saw a tiny, old costume shop tucked away between two abandoned buildings. The shop's windows were dusty, and the sign above the door was faded, but something about it drew her in. As she stepped inside, a bell rang softly overhead. The shop was small and cramped, filled with odd trinkets and costumes that looked handmade and ancient. In the dim light, Emily saw an old man behind the counter, watching her with piercing eyes. Looking for something, the man asked in a raspy voice. Emily hesitated, then nodded. "I need a mask. Something really scary." The man smiled, showing yellowed teeth. "I have just the thing," he said, disappearing into the back of the shop. He returned a moment later, holding a mask unlike anything Emily had ever seen. It was disturbingly lifelike, made of something that looked almost like human skin. The features were twisted into a grotesque grin, with hollow, black eyes that seemed to stare straight through her. "This mask is special," the old man whispered, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's not just scary. It becomes part of you." Emily shivered, but couldn't tear her eyes away from the mask. There was something about it, something that made her feel powerful just looking at it. "How much?" she asked. The old man chuckled softly. "For you, it's free. Just be sure to take care of it. Once you put it on, don't take it off until Halloween is over." Emily didn't question the man's strange warning. She was too excited to have found the perfect mask. She hurried home, eager to try it on. That night, as she stood in front of her mirror, Emily slowly slipped the mask over her face. The moment it touched her skin, a cold, tingling sensation washed over her. She looked at her reflection and gasped. The mask looked even more terrifying than it had in the shop. It fit her face perfectly, as if it had been molded just for her. The twisted grin stretched across her mouth, and the hollow eyes made her look like something from a nightmare. As she admired her reflection, she noticed something strange. The mask wasn't just sitting on her face, it was sticking to her skin. She tried to lift it off, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in as she pulled harder, but the mask only seemed to tighten, almost as if it were fusing with her flesh. Her heart raced, and she ran to the bathroom, splashing water on her face, hoping to loosen the mask. But no matter what she did, it wouldn't come off. The cold, tingling sensation spread through her body, and she felt an overwhelming urge to laugh. But the sound that escaped her lips wasn't her own. It was a harsh, inhuman cackle. As the days passed, Emily began to change. The mask wouldn't come off, and her reflection in the mirror grew more grotesque with each passing day. Her skin was pale and clammy, her eyes sunken into dark hollows, and her grin, always that twisted, horrifying grin, never left her face. Worse still, she started feeling different. Her thoughts became darker, more violent. She lashed out at her friends and family, her temper uncontrollable. The mask wasn't just changing her appearance, it was changing who she was. By the time Halloween night arrived, Emily was barely recognizable. She no longer felt like herself, something else was taking over. Desperate, she went back to the old shop, hoping the man could help her. But when she reached the spot where the shop had been, it was gone. The building was boarded up and abandoned, as if it had never been there at all. Terrified, Emily ran through the streets, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She could feel the mask tightening around her face, the cold creeping deeper into her skin. It wasn't just a costume anymore, it was part of her. As the clock struck midnight, Emily collapsed in an alleyway, gasping for air. The mask was suffocating her, the twisted grin pulling her mouth into a painful, permanent smile. She clawed at her face, but it was useless. The mask was no longer just something she wore, it had become her. When Halloween ended and the first light of dawn broke through the clouds, Emily's body was found in the alley. Her face was frozen in a grotesque grin, her eyes wide and hollow. The mask was gone, but the expression it left behind was unmistakable. No one in town could explain what had happened, but rumors spread quickly. They said that on Halloween night, If you looked closely, you could still see her wandering the streets, her twisted grin glowing in the darkness, searching for her next victim. And every year, a new mask would appear in the old costume shop, waiting for someone else to put it on. Every town has its secrets, but the one in Pinebrook was different. Hidden deep in the woods, there was a cemetery that had long been forgotten, even by those who had once tended it. No one knew why it had been abandoned, but the townspeople avoided the place, especially on Halloween. They said that if you went there on that night, you'd never come back. Max, Tyler, and Chloe had heard the rumors their whole lives, but like most teenagers, they didn't believe in ghost stories. So, on Halloween night, they decided to prove everyone wrong. Armed with flashlights and a bottle of cheap whiskey, they set out for the cemetery, laughing and joking as they made their way through the dark forest. "I bet it's just some old graves, nothing special," Max said, swinging his flashlight around. "Or maybe a few creepy statues," Chloe added, though her voice wavered slightly. Despite her bravado, she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled over her as soon as they entered the woods. Tyler was the only one who seemed completely at ease. "You guys are such babies," he laughed. "This is gonna be a piece of cake." They followed the narrow path through the trees until the air grew colder, the sky darker. Eventually, the woods opened up, revealing a small clearing where crooked, weathered tombstones jutted from the ground like broken teeth. The cemetery was ancient, overgrown with vines and moss, its iron gate hanging off its hinges. "Wow," Chloe whispered, her breath visible in the suddenly chilly air. "This place is creepy." Tyler grinned. "Exactly what we wanted, right?" They stepped through the crumbling gate, their footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dead leaves that blanketed the ground. The cemetery was silent, unnaturally so, as if the very air held its breath. Even the wind seemed to avoid this place. Max, feeling braver with the whiskey warming his chest, made his way to the largest tombstone in the center. It was covered in strange symbols, carved so deeply into the stone that they were still visible after centuries of decay. "Look at this," he called to the others. "I've never seen writing like this before." Chloe and Tyler joined him, shining their flashlights on the weathered symbols. The tombstone belonged to someone named Eliza Blackwood, but the rest of the inscription was too worn to read. Suddenly, the air grew colder still, and a sharp gust of wind blew through the cemetery, extinguishing their flashlights. They all froze, standing in total darkness, the weight of the silence pressing down on them. "Did you feel that?" Chloe whispered, her voice shaking. Before anyone could answer, a low, mournful wail rose up from the depths of the cemetery, echoing through the trees. It was a sound like no other, ancient, filled with pain and loss. The friends huddled together, their breath coming in short gasps. Tyler tried to laugh it off, but his voice cracked. "It's just the wind. Don't be scared." But Chloe wasn't listening. Her eyes were fixed on something behind them, her face pale. Slowly, Max and Tyler turned to look. In the far corner of the cemetery, a figure stood motionless, draped in tattered black robes. Its face was hidden in shadow, but its presence was undeniable. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but its cold, empty gaze bore into them, freezing them in place. "Run," Chloe whispered, her voice barely audible. But they couldn't move. The figure began to glide toward them, its robes trailing behind it like smoke. The closer it got, the colder the air became, until their breath came out in frozen puffs. Max finally snapped out of his paralysis and grabbed Chloe's hand. "We need to get out of here, now." The three of them turned and ran, stumbling over graves and roots, their flashlights forgotten on the ground. The wind howled through the trees, growing louder and louder, drowning out their panicked footsteps. The figure followed, moving with unnatural speed, its haunting wail filling the air. Tyler reached the gate first and threw it open. Chloe and Max were right behind him, but just as they crossed the threshold, Max felt a cold, bony hand grab his ankle, sending him crashing to the ground. "Max!" Chloe screamed, turning back. But as she did, the figure loomed over him, its rotting hand reaching out to pull him into the cemetery's depths. With a final burst of strength, Max kicked free and scrambled to his feet. The three friends didn't stop running until they were out of the woods and back on the main road, gasping for breath, their hearts pounding in their chests. They never spoke of that night again. The cemetery remained forgotten, hidden in the woods, but sometimes, late at night, Max could still hear the wailing of the figure, calling for him from the darkness. And every year, on Halloween, a new tombstone appeared in the cemetery. This year, when they returned, it bore his name. In the small, forgotten town of Black Hollow, Halloween had always been a solemn affair. The townsfolk didn't celebrate with costumes or candy. Instead, they lit jack-o'-lanterns and placed them in their windows as a warning to ward off the evil that lurked in the night. No one ever spoke of what the jack-o'-lanterns protected them from, but everyone in Black Hollow knew the rule. On Halloween night, never let your pumpkin's candle go out. For years, Olivia had followed the tradition, though she had never understood it. Every Halloween, her mother would carve the same menacing face into a pumpkin, light the candle inside, and place it on their porch before dusk. "Don't ever forget," her mother would say, her voice trembling with an old fear. But this year was different. Olivia was 17, and she didn't believe in old superstitions. It was just a pumpkin, after all. What harm could it do if the candle went out? That Halloween, Olivia was home alone. Her parents had left town for the weekend, trusting her to take care of the house and keep the tradition alive. She carved her own jack-o'-lantern that afternoon, though her heart wasn't in it. She scoffed at the thought of some ancient curse, but out of habit, she lit the candle inside the pumpkin and placed it on the porch as the sun dipped below the horizon. The night was unnaturally quiet. Olivia sat in the living room, scrolling through her phone, half watching a horror movie on TV. The jack-o'-lantern's flickering light cast shadows across the porch outside. Hours passed, and the stillness of the night began to weigh on her. There were no trick-or-treaters, no laughing children, no sounds at all except for the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. Around midnight, Olivia heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible scraping sound. At first, she thought it was the wind, but then it came again, louder this time. It was coming from the front porch. Her heart quickened as she got up and went to the window. The jack-o'-lantern's candle had gone out. The scraping sound stopped as soon as she looked outside, and for a moment, Olivia stood there, staring at the unlit pumpkin. Her breath fogged the glass as a chill ran down her spine. She wasn't sure why, but she felt an overwhelming urge to relight the candle. Grabbing a lighter from the kitchen, she stepped outside into the cold night air. The silence was unnerving, but she forced herself to stay calm. As she bent down to light the jack-o'-lantern, a movement caught her eye, just at the edge of the woods, behind her house. Something was standing there, watching her. She froze, the lighter trembling in her hand. The figure was tall, its outline barely visible in the darkness, but she could see its eyes, glowing faintly, like embers in the night. Without thinking, she flicked the lighter and quickly relit the candle inside the pumpkin. The moment the flame ignited, the figure disappeared, as if it had never been there. Olivia rushed back inside, slamming the door behind her, her heart racing. She tried to calm herself down, convincing herself it was just her imagination, but she couldn't shake the image of those glowing eyes. The hours dragged on, and though the candle burned brightly, Olivia couldn't relax. Every creak of the house made her jump. Every shadow seemed to move. The air grew colder, and the house felt darker than it should. At 3 a.m., the scraping sound returned. This time, it was louder, more insistent, like something was clawing at the door. Olivia's breath caught in her throat as she tiptoed to the window. The jack-o'-lantern had gone out again. She stared at it in disbelief, her hands shaking. This wasn't possible. There was no wind, no reason for the candle to keep going out. Then, from the darkness beyond the porch, she saw them. Dozens of shadowy figures, slowly emerging from the trees. Their eyes glowed the same faint red as the figures she'd seen earlier, and they were all moving toward her house. Panicking, Olivia grabbed the lighter and rushed outside, desperate to relight the pumpkin. But as she stepped onto the porch, the figures stopped. They were closer now, their glowing eyes fixed on her. She fumbled with the lighter, her hands shaking uncontrollably. The first flicker of the flame caught the wick, but before she could breathe a sigh of relief, the candle went out again. Olivia stumbled backward, her heart pounding in her chest. The figures were moving again, faster this time, closing in on her. She could hear their whispers now, low and guttural, like voices from a nightmare. Desperate, she ran back into the house and locked the door. She scrambled for her phone, but there was no signal, no way to call for help. The scratching at the door began again, followed by a heavy thud, as if something, or someone, was trying to force its way inside. Olivia backed away, her eyes darting to the jack-o'-lantern outside. The porch was swarming with the shadowy figures now, their glowing eyes peering through the windows, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. Then, with a loud crash, the front door gave way. Olivia screamed as the figures flooded into the house. They moved unnaturally fast, their cold, skeletal hands reaching for her, their voices filling her head with terrifying, incomprehensible words. She tried to run, but they surrounded her, their glowing eyes burning into her soul. The last thing she saw before the darkness consumed her was the jack-o'-lantern's flame flickering back to life. Too late. It was a chilly Halloween night when Emma and her friends decided to take a shortcut through the woods on their way to a party. The trees loomed tall, their twisted branches like skeletal hands reaching into the night sky. The full moon cast eerie shadows on the ground, and the cold wind whispered through the leaves, almost as if the forest itself was alive. As they walked deeper into the woods, Emma felt a strange sensation, like they were being watched. She shook it off at first, but the feeling grew stronger with every step. The laughter and chatter of her friends faded as she fell behind, her attention fixated on the trees. Then she saw it, a figure, standing just beyond the edge of the trail. It was tall, too tall to be human, its eyes glowing a faint, sickly yellow in the darkness. The figure didn't move, but its gaze never left her. "Guys, wait," Emma called out, her voice shaky. Her friends turned around, but when she looked back, the figure was gone. She blinked, unsure if her eyes were playing tricks on her. "What's wrong?" asked her friend, Jake, with a laugh. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Emma forced a smile, but her heart was racing. "I thought, never mind." They continued walking, but Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The woods seemed to close in around them, the air growing colder and stiller. Every now and then, she caught glimpses of movement in the trees, shadows darting between the trunks. Finally, they reached the edge of the woods, and Emma let out a sigh of relief. But just as they were about to step onto the open road, a loud snap echoed behind them, like a branch breaking underfoot. They turned around, and there it was again, the tall, shadowy figure, standing at the edge of the woods, its glowing eyes fixed on Emma. This time, it began to move, slowly, deliberately, stepping out from the trees and into the moonlight. Her friends froze in fear as the figure moved closer, its twisted form becoming clearer. It wore tattered clothing, its face a pale, featureless mask, except for the hollow, glowing eyes. Without a word, they all ran. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as they sprinted down the road, the sound of footsteps behind them growing louder. She dared not look back. When they finally reached the house where the party was being held, they burst through the door, gasping for breath. Emma looked out the window, but the figure was gone. Her friends laughed nervously, brushing it off as a Halloween prank. But Emma knew better. That night, when she returned home and climbed into bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching her. As she lay there, staring at the ceiling, she heard it, a faint tap on her window. Slowly, she turned her head. There, just outside, were two glowing yellow eyes, watching her in the darkness.